Okay, and welcome to Hashem's podcast brought to you by ANZEG Institute Australia. So, DW, BBC, CNN, Reuters, Bloomberg, Voice of America have all had contributions from our guest this evening, and it's afternoon in New York. So, as the Iran war rages on, we'll be speaking this afternoon in New York at 3 p.m. to Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics, geopolitical risk consultancy based in Washington, D.C. His research interests include geopolitical and security trends in the Arabian Peninsula and the broader Middle East. Mr. Cafiero is the regular contributor to several publications, including AI Monitor, The National Interest, the Low Blog. From 2014 to 2015, he has been an analyst at Kroll, an investigative due diligence consultancy. He received an MA in International Relations from the University of San Diego. So let's welcome Giorgio to the podcast.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you for accepting our invitation on such short notice. So you're all the way in New York. There's a lot happening, obviously. This is our second analyst to come on the podcast to speak about Iran. So let's begin with, so what are the goals that the US and Israel have sought to achieve in waging this war on Iran? I mean, let's take it from the beginning. I know it's we're past 7 days in, but it's always good to go back to the foundation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on as your guest. It's really an honor to be with you today. I think what we can say for sure is that the US and Israel share a desire in seeing to it that Iran ceases to be a state in the Middle East that is capable of resisting US and Israeli plans for the region. Since 1979, Iran has been in a state of resistance against the United States and its Western allies. Iran has had a vision for the region that entails a rejection of Washington's dominance in the Middle East. And anti-Zionism has long been a pillar of the Iranian regime's purpose in its foreign policy. I think what's clear is that for a long time, the Israeli government has been attempting to overthrow the Iranian government and also to weaken the Iranian nation state as much as possible, even if overthrowing the government is not possible. Iran is a very, very large, diverse country. Many ethnic minority groups exist, especially along the periphery parts of Iran. And so Israel has long desired a fragmentation of Iran, largely along ethnic lines. The idea is to basically see to it that Iran is totally divided, very weakened, and thus unable to challenge Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. The United States is pursuing a set of goals that are a bit less clear. One of the main reason why I say that is because President Trump is really all over the map, making it so difficult to really understand exactly what motivated him to launch this war on Iran at the end of last month. We're not really sure. Is this about simply eradicating the Iranian nuclear program, eradicating the missile program, destroying the country's navy, but leaving the regime in place, albeit in a much weaker spot? Or is the Trump White House on the same page as Netanyahu's government in wanting to overthrow the Iranian government? Some statements from Trump suggest so, others totally contradict that. He is talking about the need for the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow their government as the bombs are raining down on their country. But then at other moments, he talks about his willingness to strike a new deal with Iran and take advantage of diplomatic off ramps. So whether the US and Israeli governments are really on the same page about the question of regime change, not entirely clear. But what we can definitely say, though, is that both the United States and Israel have a vision for a new geopolitical order in the Middle East in which Iran is no longer a powerful force of resistance.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like there is any sign of uprising from the from the people in Iran anyway. It's interesting. So, why did the why did Iran respond by attacking the GCC, states, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE? I mean, these nation states, or they haven't had any sort of war since their creation after the First World War. They've always been peaceful, accepting foreigners, great, countries that are, prosperous and doing some amazing work in the region. And there's a lot of sort of friendly. Recently, they've been friendly with Iran. So why would Iran attack these nation states?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. I think it's important to begin by pointing out that in the months leading up to Operation Epic Fury, when the Trump administration was threatening to bomb Iran, the leadership in Tehran made it very clear that if Iran is to be bombed, all US military bases in the Middle East are legitimate targets, and that Iran would not hesitate to fire missiles and drones at those targets. Now, there's a huge US military presence in the Gulf Arab countries, so understandably so, leaders in the GCC states were very worried that if the US and slash or Israel were to wage these military operations against Iran, that they would get caught up in the conflict. While these might be US military bases, they do exist on the soil of the Gulf Arab states, and therefore any Iranian strike against those bases would be, from the Gulf Arab perspectives, a violation of their sovereignty and a threat to their security. So the GCC states tried to prepare for this exact scenario by doing a few things. One, they wanted to minimize the risk of this conflict breaking out by trying to persuade Trump that bombing Iran would be a horrible idea. Two, they tried to improve diplomatic relations with Iran. And we saw, especially in the case of Saudi Arabia, there has been a detente in Saudi Iranian relations. Well, maybe not anymore as of the past 11 days, but at least up until late last month, beginning in 2023, there was a state of detente. And the thinking was that better diplomatic relations with Iran would minimize the risks of Iran lashing out against the GCC states. And then number three, the GCC countries made it very clear to Iran that if the Americans and Israelis would wage military operations against Iran, those would not be done from military bases in the Gulf, nor would the GCC states' airspace be used in such operations. The thinking was that these three tactics could protect the GCC states from the risk of an escalating military confrontation in the Middle East. Unfortunately, that did not work out, and all six GCC states have been targeted since the end of February, in the immediate aftermath of the American-Israeli war on Iran beginning. So to get to your question, why did Iran choose to wage these strikes against the six GCC states? I think Iran is trying to basically create chaos in the region and to try to create a nightmarish scenario for the GCC states that will result in their leaders putting pressure on Trump to halt the American and Israeli aggression on Iran as soon as possible. Just to remind your viewers, since late February, these Iranian retaliatory strikes have been hitting very high revenue generating targets in the Gulf that the economies of the GCC states really depend on. We're talking about energy facilities, luxury hotels, apartment complexes, ports, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, the GCC states have certain economic models that depend very much on stability. The ability of the GCC states to attract investment from abroad, to attract tourists from all over the world, to become countries where expats from the West and really countries all over the world can come and work, depends on these countries maintaining an image of peace and stability. So Iran only had to fire a few missiles and drones at Dubai and other cities in the Gulf to completely shatter that image. And also with strikes on energy facilities, those strikes really target the engines of the economies of countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So Iran understands that the peace in the Gulf is very fragile, and the GCC states have no appetite for prolonged warfare that poses nothing short of an existential threat to their economic health. Therefore, Iran's thinking is if they pull the GCC states into this conflict, that is going to result in them putting pressure on the Trump administration to halt the aggression immediately. Secondly, I would add that for decades, Iran has seen the US military presence in these countries as a direct threat to the Islamic Republic. And the leadership in Tehran has long tried to convince the Arab states of the Persian Gulf that them hosting US military at these bases will not lead to them having greater security. And by attacking these countries, under the banner of lashing out at the US military presence there, Iran sends a very powerful message to the GCC states that the US military presence on their soil is actually a source of insecurity rather than security for them. And I think Iran is hopeful that maybe the GCC states in the post-conflict period will reassess their relationships with Washington and possibly eject the US military presence from their lands. Now, if that's going to happen, time will tell. I think Iran has to also consider that this is a high stakes gamble, and this strategy is quite risky because there's a possibility that the GCC states would reluctantly double down on their military alliances and partnerships with the United States to protect them from what the GCC states now see as an increasingly serious threat posed by Iran. So we don't know how it's going to play out, but I hope that sort of explains the
Yeah,
rationale
makes
behind
a lot of
Iran's
sense.
decision to target
Mhm.
these third countries.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there's a lot of talk in the West, obviously, internally, about oil prices and, divided talk about what's going to happen. So we can probably leave that to the next episode about what the talk is internally in places like America, Canada, the UK. But what are the implications of this conflict for the US foreign policy on in the Gulf now? So you've spoken a lot about the pressure from Iran, but how's the Gulf going to respond to you know, what's happening to them, and how does that affect the foreign policy of America?
Great question. At this point, it's a little too early to tell, but what we can say at this point is that the Gulf states are very angry about what has happened. They knew full well that the Americans and slash or Israelis carrying out this war on Iran would not be quick, and it would have very destabilizing effects all over the Middle East. The consequences would create many serious economic and security problems for the Gulf Arab states. They tried very hard to convince Trump to pursue diplomacy with Iran, and the GCC states, especially the Sultanate of Oman, invested a lot of energy into diplomatic efforts aimed at giving the Trump administration and Iran an off ramp here to prevent this war from erupting. Their view was that Iran was actually quite weak at the time of this war beginning. As a consequence of the Syrian government falling in late 2024, Hezbollah suffering humiliating losses in its conflict with Israel in 2023 and 2024, the domestic turmoil inside Iran, also American and Israeli attacks on Iran that took place in 2024 and 2025. Their view was that Iran and its axis of resistance throughout the Middle East was already quite weak, and that the United States was in a position to enter a new nuclear deal with Iran that would have really limited Iran's nuclear program to the point where its level of enrichment would be so low, it would just basically be a token nuclear program. So again, the Gulf Arab view was that this war was just beyond reckless and totally unnecessary. And the Omani foreign minister even traveled to Washington on February 27th, the day before the US and Israel launched this war. And he bent over backwards to try to salvage hope for diplomacy. He did everything he could to prevent this conflict. And so when the war began, the Gulf states were beyond angry at Washington for going this route, beyond angry at the Trump White House. However, as we discussed, Iran immediately retaliated in ways that have basically set the Gulf on fire since the end of February. And so the Gulf states now have realized that the United States, well, this is not the first time they've realized it, but they have again realized that the United States has not been able to protect them from regional threats. As your viewers know, for decades, the United States has been the security guarantor for all 6 GCC states. So when Iranian missiles and drones are crashing into airports, hotels, energy facilities in the GCC states, this forces the Gulf Arabs to ask, in practice, what is the utility of having these U.S. military bases here? What is the utility of the U.S. defense umbrella? It has failed to protect the GCC states.
Yeah,
What
definitely.
makes this very complicated, however, is the fact that it's not clear if any other power in the world would be willing and capable of replacing the United States as a security guarantor for any of the 6 GCC
True.
states.
Yeah.
So I think all 6 GCC members are very frustrated with the United States. Their levels of confidence in America as a security guarantor has greatly diminished, but they are not in a position to turn to another power like France, Russia, or China to replace the United States as a security guarantor. So they feel very vulnerable. And I think what we're going to see from the Gulf Arab states moving forward is an attempt to become more autonomous from Washington. I think they're going to invest a lot more in their armed forces and their militaries to try to be able to defend their countries more independently. And I think we're going to see sort of a new period of militarization in which the Gulf Arab states try to become less reliant on the United States for defense. But that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to
Yeah.
take quite a while for the GCC states to achieve that level of security autonomy. And so I think they're basically stuck, very reluctantly so, with a security guarantor that they don't have much confidence in.
Yeah. So you're saying they're not ready, obviously, to, look after themselves, basically. But at the moment, are these Gulf Arab monarchies, would they be likely to approach Iran after the rhetoric, dust settles? How would they try to, how would they approach Iran? How would they communicate with them or speak to them after all this settles down?
I think they are going to be of the view that engagement with Iran is necessary. Let's keep in mind that the GCC states are in a fragile period in their histories where they're trying to end their dependence on hydrocarbon resources and to prepare for a future in which they have to rely on non-hydrocarbon sectors to maintain their prosperity. And the GCC countries have these different visions, such as Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which aims to, like I said, achieve economic development and diversification beyond oil and gas. To make this happen, they need to attract a lot of foreign direct investment in their economies. They need to attract tourists from all over the world because tourism is a pillar of their diversification agendas. Point being, they need stability in the neighborhood for any of this to succeed. And therefore, they don't want a prolonged confrontation with Iran. They want to talk to the Iranians. They want to find a way to bring stability back to the Gulf. But at the same time, Iran's aggression against these countries will result in them having even less trust in Iran than they did before the end of February. There were already many suspicions between the GCC countries and Iran before this conflict. There's obviously a history of a tense rivalry between some of the GCC states, especially Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I think the fact that Iran waged these missile and drone attacks against major cities in the GCC states and targeted civilian infrastructure is going to really harm relationships between the UAE and Iran and other GCC countries and Iran. Should obviously point out UAE has been hit the hardest by these Iranian strikes since the end of February. And now the president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, has started to use the word enemy to describe Iran. So, in short, to kind of summarize everything I'm saying here, I think they're going to want to engage Iran and to try to mitigate the tensions in their relationships with Iran. But their relationships with Iran are going to be very much impacted by the aggression that Iran has waged against the GCC states, and it's going to make it harder for trust to get rebuilt moving forward.
So the GCC states are losing trust in both the Americans and the Iranians. Interesting.
That's right.
One last question. I know we've taken a lot of your time today, and we will have to get you on again because this war seems to be ongoing. So our last analyst, we spoke about, Keir Starmer not getting initially involved in the war, not like Tony Blair back in the Iraq 2003 war. But who might be getting involved are Russia, Turkey, and China. So what can we say about the recent advancements or developments of Russia, Turkey, and China getting involved?
Well, these three countries were very upset to see the United States and Israel wage this war on Iran. Russia, China, and Turkey see themselves having a lot to lose from this Middle East crisis escalating further and further. Um, in the case of Russia, let's talk about that country first. So many people have been talking about ways in which Russia can benefit from this conflict, and sure, there is something to say about the fact that the because of a shift in the U.S. policy toward the Russia sanctions, India is now is more room for buying Russian oil. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down, there are opportunities for the Northern Sea Route via Russia to become more important to the global economy. Less ability of the Western countries to give Ukraine military support, with more resources going into defending Israel and Gulf Arab states. So all of that, we can say, bodes well for Russia. But at the end of the day, Iran is an important partner of Putin's government. And in the event that the Iranian nation state would fragment, that could create a lot of chaos that spills into the Caucasus and Central Asia. These countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union, in which exist along Russia's southern frontier, are countries where Russia has vested interests. And the Caucasus, the South Caucasus, and then even the North Caucasus and southern Russia, this is a part of the world where Russia never welcomes instability. And also in Central Asia, Russia is a dominant actor in the possibility of instability spilling into those countries is extremely problematic from Moscow's standpoint. And this helps us understand why Putin very recently had a phone call with Trump in which he presented proposals for winding down this conflict as quickly as possible. So I think Russia is going to be cautious before it gets involved. I'm not expecting Russia to get involved in the conflict directly, but I think Russia will try to play its cards to sort of back Iran in mostly diplomatic ways, while also trying to use its influence to help wind down the conflict as soon as possible. Granted, there are serious limits to Russian influence, and we don't know how effective Moscow is going to be in its efforts to sort of help the different sides move toward de-escalation. But I think ultimately de-escalation is what Russia wants more than anything else. When it comes to China, same thing is true. I don't expect Beijing to get involved militarily. China's involvement in the Middle East is mostly about economics and diplomacy, especially since March 2023, when Beijing played a critical role in bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran toward their renormalization agreement, their their diplomatic agreement that was signed in Beijing on March 10. Well, actually, 3 years ago today, actually. But China does not get involved militarily in Middle Eastern crises. China tries to maintain a balanced geopolitical position in the Middle East, but the main concern for China has to do with how this conflict can impact China's economic interests as an Asian power that is very dependent on gas and oil from the Gulf states. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz is certainly disturbing from Beijing's perspective. China also is very focused on the Belt and Road Initiative, which will depend on stability in Eurasia in the years and the decades ahead. So naturally, a conflict like this one that seems to be escalating with each and every passing day is going to trouble China. So China is very much focused on supporting Iran, but mostly through statements and diplomatic maneuvers, emphasizing the importance of the international community respecting Iran's sovereignty and independence. But I think China, above all else, just really wants to see this conflict de-escalate as quickly as possible. At the same time, China will always try to be opportunistic. And I think at a time when many Arab countries and countries throughout the global South at large are looking at this crisis in the Middle East and thinking that the United States' foreign policy is reckless and unhinged, this gives China further opportunity to present itself as a responsible global power that can actually succeed in terms of bringing stability to parts of the world, such as the Middle East. So in that sense, from a soft power point of view, I think this war can serve Chinese interests, even if its immediate effects can prove very harmful to Beijing. Lastly, you're asking about Turkey. Turkey obviously sharing hundreds of miles of border with Iran is really a country on the front lines. Ankara is very disturbed by this conflict and the ways in which it's spilling into different countries throughout the neighborhood. Allegedly, the Iranians have fired missiles on, I believe, 2 occasions at Turkey to target a U.S. military base in Gergio. NATO intercepted those missiles. Nonetheless, the longer this conflict goes on, Turkey will have more and more reason to be concerned about itself suffering from the spillover effects and being pulled into the conflict, either directly or indirectly. What's key for us to appreciate when talking about the Turkish perspective on this war is the fact that any scenario in which the Iranian nation state fragments is a nightmare for Ankara. We have to consider that if there is a collapse of the Iranian nation state and you have certain Kurdish factions that try to take advantage of the chaos to establish some sort of a autonomous or perhaps entirely independent Kurdish entity in Iran, that could have a huge impact on sort of the Middle East's overall Kurdish question. This, from Ankara's perspective, would pose an enormous threat to Turkey's own security and geopolitical interests. Also, as your viewers remember, during the 2010s, there were millions of Syrians who came into Turkey as refugees. That refugee crisis in Turkey, if I remember correctly, there were 4 million Syrians who came into Turkey as refugees. That created huge burdens on the Turks, many societal tensions, security dilemmas, financial burdens came from that refugee crisis. So at a time in which a number of those, a percentage of those Syrians are now returning to Syria, Turkey has been trying to move past that refugee crisis from the 2010s. So any scenario in which we could have a massive influx of Iranian refugees into Turkey is really the last thing that Ankara wants. At the same time, Turkey has very important relationships with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Those countries invest a lot in the Turkish economy, a lot of trade between Turkey and the GCC states. So naturally, the Iranian attacks on the GCC countries poses an enormous threat to Turkey's own interests in the Gulf. And therefore, like China and Russia, I think Turkey really wants to see de-escalation as quickly as possible. And the leadership in Ankara has been really stepping up since late February to try to do everything it can to bring about such de-escalation, as challenging as that is.
Well, thank you so much for your time and analysis. So we've been listening with Giorgio Cafiero, CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics Washington. Thank you so much for your time and your great analysis. We'll get you on the show again soon. You've been listening to Hashem's podcast brought to you by ANZEG Institute. Have a great night and great afternoon in New York. Goodbye.